While a drone attack was unfolding at one of the most strategically vital oil terminals on the planet, an Indian-flagged tanker was sitting directly at the loading point, connected to the facility's single-point mooring, taking on nearly 81,000 metric tons of Murban crude oil. The crew of the Jag Laadki didn't have the luxury of watching events unfold from a safe distance. They were at the precise coordinates where the strike was happening. And yet, roughly 24 hours later, that vessel sailed away from Fujairah, fully loaded, crew unharmed, cargo intact. How that happened and what it reveals about the collapsing security environment across the Persian Gulf is a story that connects a single ship's escape to a crisis threatening energy supplies for over 1 billion people. The date was March 14th, 2026. The Fujairah oil terminal, positioned on the UAE's eastern coastline just outside the Strait of Hormuz, came under drone attack. Fire broke out near the loading infrastructure, and some operations were immediately suspended. Fujairah processes approximately 1 million barrels per day of the UAE's Murban crude, a volume that represents roughly 1% of total global oil demand flowing through a single facility. Its location is precisely what gives it such outsized strategic value. Unlike every other major Gulf export terminal, Fujairah doesn't require tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. In a region where that narrow waterway has become an active conflict zone, Fujairah functions as the UAE's emergency exit for crude exports. And on March 14th, that emergency exit came under direct fire. The attack didn't materialize from nowhere. It followed a specific chain of escalation that had been building with alarming speed. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a bombing campaign targeting Iran. By mid-March, U.S. forces had struck over 90 military targets on Iran's Karg Island, the coral outcrop that handles 90% of Iranian crude exports. Tehran responded by effectively shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, deploying mines, armed drones, and anti-ship missiles to halt commercial traffic through the choke point that carries 20% of the world's oil and a significant share of global LNG shipments. And then Iran turned its attention to the facilities that Gulf states were relying on to bypass the blockade. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps publicly declared that U.S. interests in the UAE, including ports and docking facilities, were legitimate military targets. Iranian state media went further, broadcasting warnings to civilians near Jebel Ali Port in Dubai, Khalifa Port in Abu Dhabi, and Fujairah, advising them to leave the areas. The threat was explicit, specific, and followed by action. The drone attack on Fujairah was a direct signal. Iran would not allow its adversaries to route around the Hormuz blockade without cost. Which brings us back to the Jag Laadki, sitting at the single-point mooring while all of this was unfolding around it. The single-point mooring is exactly what it sounds like. A floating buoy anchored offshore, connected to subsea pipelines that pump crude oil directly into a vessel's tanks. When a tanker is attached to an SPM and actively loading, it is essentially stationary, tethered in place, unable to maneuver freely. It is, in those moments, about as vulnerable as a large commercial vessel can be. The Jag Laadki was in precisely that position when the attack struck the Fujairah terminal. The crew, all Indian nationals, found themselves at the intersection of an active military strike and the physical inability to simply pull away and leave. What happened over the following hours involved a coordinated response across multiple layers of Indian government infrastructure. The Directorate General of Shipping Control Room, which had been operating as a crisis nerve center since the conflict escalated, was managing communications at an extraordinary volume. Nearly 3,000 phone calls and more than 5,357 emails processed in the span of this crisis. The DG Shipping was coordinating in real time with the Ministry of External Affairs, Indian diplomatic missions in the Gulf, and the shipping companies operating vessels in the region. The goal was singular and urgent: get Indian vessels and crews out of harm's way while preserving the cargo that India's energy supply chain desperately needed. By 10:30 in the morning Indian Standard Time on March 15th, roughly 24 hours after the attack, the Jag Laadki departed Fujairah, fully loaded with 80,800 metric tons of Murban crude, its entire crew confirmed safe and accounted for. It became the fourth Indian-flagged vessel to successfully exit the war zone unharmed since the conflict began. A quiet but significant operational victory, achieved under conditions that could have ended very differently. But the safe departure of one ship, however important, does almost nothing to resolve the structural crisis bearing down on India's energy security. And the numbers behind that crisis are staggering. If the story of the Jag Laadki reveals what coordinated crisis management can accomplish under pressure, the broader picture reveals how vast the challenge remains, and why the next few weeks could determine whether India faces manageable disruption or genuine energy shortfalls. India imports 88% of its crude oil. More than half of that crude, before this conflict erupted, came from West Asia, the very region now engulfed in war. Natural gas dependency on imports stands at 50%, with roughly 30% sourced from the same area. And then there's liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, used by hundreds of millions of Indian households for cooking. India imports 60% of its LPG, and between 85 and 90% of those imports originate from West Asian suppliers. Every one of those supply lines runs through or adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz. When that choke point closed, it didn't create a theoretical risk for Indian energy security. It created an immediate, tangible one. If you're starting to grasp the scale of what India is navigating right now, the sheer concentration of supply chain risk funneled through a single conflict zone, drop your thoughts in the comments. The decisions being made in the next few weeks will affect energy prices and availability far beyond the Gulf. As of March 15th, 2026, 22 Indian-flagged vessels manned by 611 seafarers remain stranded on the western side of the Persian Gulf. These ships cannot transit the Strait of Hormuz. They are effectively locked in place, unable to deliver their cargo to Indian ports, unable to return home. Every day those vessels sit idle, the supply gap widens. Every day those 611 crew members remain in an active conflict zone. The human cost of this crisis deepens. And the Indian government's crisis management apparatus, however effective it proved in the case of the Jag Laadki, is being stretched across a challenge that grows more complex with each passing day. So far, 276 seafarers have been repatriated through coordinated efforts between DG Shipping, the Ministry of External Affairs, and Indian diplomatic missions abroad. 23 of those repatriations occurred in just the 24 hours surrounding the Fujairah attack. The pace is relentless, and the operational burden is immense. Yet amid the crisis, Indian diplomacy has produced at least one breakthrough that deserves close attention, because it reveals something about how the geopolitics of this blockade actually function in practice. And it may point toward a model for future negotiations. On the same day as the Fujairah attack, March 14th, Iran granted a rare exception to its Hormuz blockade. 2 Indian-flagged LPG carriers, the Shivalik and the Nanda Devi, were permitted to cross the strait. The Shivalik, carrying a portion of roughly 92,712 metric tons of LPG split between the two vessels, was scheduled to arrive at Mundra port on March 16th. The Nanda Devi was bound for Kandla port, with an expected arrival on March 17th. These ships had been among the 24 Indian vessels initially stranded when the war broke out. Through diplomatic channels, India negotiated their release, a conditional, limited safe passage agreement that allowed 2 specific ships carrying a specific cargo type to transit a waterway that Iran had otherwise sealed shut. The significance of this goes beyond 2 ships and their LPG cargo. It demonstrates that Iran's blockade, while broadly enforced, is not absolute in every case. Tehran is making selective decisions about which vessels to allow through and under what conditions. That creates a narrow, but potentially expandable diplomatic opening, a framework where bilateral negotiations between India and Iran could secure additional transit permissions, particularly for cargo categories that serve civilian populations rather than military purposes. Whether that opening widens or collapses depends on the trajectory of the broader conflict and the diplomatic skill applied to exploiting it. There is another dimension to the evolving threat landscape that demands attention because it changes the risk calculus for every vessel operating in the Gulf. And it's not the missiles or the mines that most analysts had long focused on. The emerging primary threat vector is sea drones. Footage from recent attacks in the region has captured small, speedboat-shaped unmanned craft racing across the water's surface toward commercial vessels and detonating on impact. These are not the aerial drones that have dominated conflict coverage for the past several years. Naval drones operate at the waterline, making them extremely difficult to detect on radar. They can carry explosive payloads significantly larger than their airborne counterparts, in some cases, security experts note, rivaling the destructive capacity of ballistic missiles. They are designed to strike ships at their most vulnerable points: the waterline, the hull, the engine housing. Areas where a successful hit can immobilize a vessel, breach its integrity, or ignite its cargo. Since the conflict escalated in late February, 9 tankers have been attacked across the region. The tactical shift towards sea drones represents a qualitative change in the threat environment. Traditional anti-piracy measures and even conventional naval defenses were largely designed around threats from above: aircraft, missiles, airborne drones, or below: mines and torpedoes. Waterline drone attacks occupy a gap in many existing defense architectures. Ships transiting the Gulf are now facing a threat that moves fast, flies low, or rather doesn't fly at all, carries devastating payloads, and can be deployed in numbers that overwhelm point defense systems. For the 22 Indian vessels still stranded west of the strait, and for any commercial traffic attempting to move through or near the conflict zone, this threat compounds every other risk factor already in play. A tanker loaded with crude oil struck by a sea drone at the waterline faces catastrophic consequences, not only for the crew and the cargo, but for the marine environment and the broader shipping corridor. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. The intersection of military technology, energy security, and Gulf geopolitics is going to remain one of the defining stories of 2026, and the dynamics are shifting week by week. Against this backdrop, the question of what India and other stakeholders should actually do becomes urgent and concrete. The Jag Laadki's safe departure and the negotiated transit of the Shivalik and Nanda Devi represent tactical successes. Individual vessels extracted from danger through coordination, diplomacy, and operational competence. But tactical successes do not resolve structural vulnerabilities. India's overwhelming dependence on Gulf energy imports, channeled through a single choke point now controlled by a hostile military force, is a systemic risk that no amount of crisis phone calls and email coordination can permanently address. Port diversification stands as the most immediate strategic priority. Fujairah's value as a Hormuz bypass makes it indispensable. But the March 14th attack proved that even bypass infrastructure is targetable. Reliance on any single loading point or transit corridor concentrates risk in ways that a determined adversary can exploit. Identifying and developing alternative loading arrangements, whether through different Gulf of Oman facilities, Omani ports, or entirely different supply regions, reduces the catastrophic potential of any one facility going offline. Anti-drone defenses represent another critical gap. The sea drone threat is relatively new in its current form, and the countermeasures deployed at most commercial maritime facilities were not designed to address it. Critical loading infrastructure, particularly exposed assets like single-point moorings, where vessels are stationary and tethered during cargo operations, requires dedicated counter-drone systems capable of detecting and neutralizing both aerial and surface-level unmanned threats. The technology exists, but deploying it across the Gulf's extensive network of terminals, anchorages, and shipping lanes requires investment, coordination, and urgency that matches the speed at which the threat is evolving. Naval escorts for high-value cargo transits have moved from a theoretical option to a practical necessity. The Indian Navy, along with international naval task forces operating in the region, faces increasing pressure to provide physical security for commercial vessels moving through the highest-risk corridors. Coordinating those escorts, matching naval assets to merchant shipping schedules across a vast and dynamic operating area is logistically demanding. But the alternative is leaving laden tankers and LPG carriers to transit contested waters without protection, a risk that the events of recent weeks have shown to be unacceptable. And then there are India's strategic petroleum reserves. The country has been building domestic reserve capacity, but the pace of that buildup now confronts a timeline that has dramatically accelerated. Every barrel held in domestic storage represents a buffer against exactly this kind of supply disruption, a day or a week of consumption that doesn't depend on a tanker successfully navigating a war zone. Accelerating the filling of those reserves, while the supply lines that remain open are still functioning, is an immediate priority that directly reduces India's exposure to the worst-case scenarios now in play. The Indian government's crisis management infrastructure has performed credibly under extreme pressure. The DG shipping control room's handling of thousands of communications, the coordination with diplomatic missions, the repatriation of hundreds of seafarers, the negotiation of safe passage exceptions with Iran, all of these represent a system operating near its limits, but delivering results. The recommendation emerging from multiple quarters is to formalize and expand this apparatus into a permanent, integrated early warning framework, a 24/7 liaison cell connecting DG Shipping, the Ministry of Petroleum, and India's foreign missions in the Gulf, providing continuous situational awareness and trigger-based alerts on port closures, drone activity, and shifting conflict boundaries. What the Jag Laadki story ultimately illustrates, beyond the immediate drama of a tanker escaping an attack zone, is the razor-thin margin that currently separates manageable disruption from genuine crisis for a nation of 1.4 billion people dependent on energy imports from the most volatile region on Earth. If someone in your life doesn't yet understand why fuel prices are climbing, and why the situation in the Gulf matters directly to daily life in India and across Asia, share this with them. These are connections that affect everyone, and the situation is far from resolved. 4 Indian vessels have now made it out safely. The Jag Laadki, the Shivalik, the Nanda Devi, the Jag Prakash, which sailed from Sohar, Oman, carrying gasoline bound for Tanga, Tanzania. 4 ships, 4 crews, 4 cargoes delivered or en route. Those are real accomplishments, achieved under conditions that test every system involved: diplomatic, logistical, operational, human. But 22 vessels remain stranded. 611 seafarers remain in the conflict zone. The Strait of Hormuz remains functionally closed. Sea drones are proliferating as a weapon of maritime warfare. And the conflict that produced all of this shows no sign of approaching a negotiated resolution. The margin between a disruption India can absorb and one that fundamentally strains its energy supply is defined not by the ships that made it out, but by the ones that haven't. Every day, those 22 vessels sit motionless west of Hormuz. The arithmetic of energy dependency presses harder. And the question that sits over all of it, whether diplomacy can open corridors faster than conflict can close them, remains unanswered, with consequences that extend from the loading docks of Fujairah to the kitchen stoves and fuel pumps of a nation that cannot afford to wait much longer for a resolution.